Hey guys, do you struggle getting whiskers or highlights on top of your pastel drawings? In this video, I'll go through my top 7 tips for getting those details. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. There are a few reasons why you might be struggling to get those whiskers or fine details, but the issues are usually something to do with the process leading up to those fine details. So in the first few tips, I'll share my process that lets you achieve the ideal conditions to be able to add those whiskers in your final layer. The first tip is to use the right paper. I wouldn't recommend using just a generic paper labeled as pastel paper because they don't allow me to create detailed realism. The paper that I choose to work on is Clairefontaine Pastel Mat, which feels like a sanded paper with a really fine tooth. But you could just use another sanded paper like UArt, Fisher 400, or any of the other papers like that you prefer, and you'll achieve similar results. The reason why I recommend pastel mat or a sanded paper is because the generic pastel papers don't allow the pastel to grip to the surface very well. You can't add many layers of pastel in comparison to a sanded paper. This means that by the time you do a base layer and a second layer to add some texture, you may find that your paper won't let you add more details on top. Some generic papers can also be really textured, which makes your end result look grainy and it's even harder to get crisp details. Pastel mat allows you to add many more layers than that, and it's also a smooth texture, so you can add in all of those fine details on top of your base layers quite easily. Tip number 2 is to use your harder pastels or pan pastels in the first few layers. Harder pastels like Conte sticks, Prismacolor NuPastels, or even pastel pencils don't fill up the texture of your paper as quickly as if you used these soft pastels like the Rembrandt sticks, Unison, or other soft pastel sticks. Pan pastels can also be laid down in light layers, which allows you to avoid adding too much pastel too quickly. If you don't know what pan pastels are, I'll leave a link in the description to a video that explains what they are and how they work. Soft pastel sticks release a lot of pigment onto your paper very quickly, which is why they're so vibrant, but it stops you being able to add more pigment on top in later layers. So you'll want to avoid adding too much pastel too early on, and a good way to do that is to use your harder pastels first and then save your softer pastels for the last layer. And this leads me into my third tip, which is to blend out your pastels in between layers. You can blend out your pastels with your fingers, a cotton tip, or a blending stump to push the pastel into the tooth of the paper. And this stops the pastel from just sitting on the surface and it pushes it into the grooves of the paper. And if you don't know what I mean by the tooth, it's kind of like your paper has little hills and valleys. So when you apply your pastel, it's skimming across the top of the hills and eventually fills up the valleys. When you fill up the tooth, it creates a smooth, slick surface that you can't add any more layers to because it can't grip onto anything. If you blend your pastel in between each layer, you'll push it into the valleys a bit more, and that will allow your hills to still be there for your next layer of pastel to grip onto. The fourth tip is to not put too many layers down. Although you can add more layers on pastel mat or a sanded paper, and even more if you blend it out in between each layer, there will still come a point where you can't add more layers because you filled up the tooth. The more projects that you do and the more you practice, the more you'll be able to recognize when you're putting too much pastel down. You want to make sure that you can add in those detail layers and leave enough wiggle room to do any corrections. An example of my layering process will usually start with a light base layer with pan pastel, and then I'll add 1 to 2 layers of a harder pastel like Conte sticks, Prismacolor NuPastel, or even pastel pencils, and then I'll do another 1 or 2 layers of details using mainly pastel pencils. This isn't how I always work, but it gives you a general idea of how many layers you can comfortably add. You can vary how you layer your pastels, but you want to start paying attention to how smooth your paper is starting to feel when you keep adding layers. The smoother it starts to feel and the less grit you can feel from your paper, the less layers you're going to be able to add on top. Before I move on to the 5th tip, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then head over and check out my Patreon channel. For as little as $4 per month, you will have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded in a variety of mediums like pastel, colored pencil, graphite, watercolor, and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so that you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. My 5th tip for adding whiskers is to make sure that your pencil is sharp enough. When you actually get to the point where you're wanting to add your whiskers, you'll need to have quite a sharp point. When your pencil is a little bit blunt, it can tend to blend in with the layers below. Whereas if you have a sharper point, it almost cuts through the layers to create a crisp line. For most of the drawing, you don't need to have your pencils too sharp. If you do manage to get a really fine point on pastel pencils, they tend to crumble and not last very long, so you could easily sharpen away your pencil very quickly if you try to have a sharp point throughout your entire project. So I usually only have a sharp point for whiskers, and throughout the rest of my process I just sharpen the pencil by scraping away the wooden casing from around the pencil with a craft knife or a Stanley knife, and I just use it like that. But when it comes time to actually sharpen it to a fine point for the whiskers, there are a few ways you can do it, but the best 2 ways that I have found is by either using a manual crank handle sharpener. The 2 brands of manual crank handle sharpeners that I've used in the past are the Swordfish and the Derwent Superpoint Mini, or just the Derwent Superpoint. Those 2 are really great for getting the sharper point on pastel pencils. You can also use a craft knife and then use sandpaper to get an even finer point. The second method does take a little bit longer, but you're more likely to get a sharper point without your pencil crumbling. Just keep in mind that it won't go as sharp as a coloured pencil will, and that's just the nature of pastel pencils because they're much softer, but you can get it sharp enough to add whiskers. Pastel pencils will blunt the blades of your sharpener quite quickly as well, so to keep your blades sharper for longer, you can run a woodless graphite pencil through your sharpener after every few pencils, and that will help. My 6th tip is to use softer pastels if you have already filled up the tooth of your paper. The softer pastels like the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils, the Rembrandt soft pastel sticks, and other brands like Unison and Sennelier in the soft pastel sticks will go on top of layers where your harder pastels just won't. And the reason why is that more pigment comes off of the softer pastels when you apply them to your paper in comparison to harder pastels. This will help you layer in any highlights or whiskers on top of layers where you're really stuck and can't seem to use your normal pastel pencils to get those details. The softer pastels can work really well for any area where you need a pop of colour or a brighter highlight, or where you need to add whiskers. I have a few Caran d'Ache pastel pencils, like a white, a black and a dark brown, which I only use in the last layer to add those whiskers if I need it. I will always try and use the Faber-Castell Pitt pastels or the Stabilo Carbothello or the Derwent first, and I only resort to the Caran d'Ache if I'm really stuck. These pastel pencils are quite expensive and they crumble easily, so I only use them when I really need to. And to sharpen the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils, I wouldn't recommend any sharpener, even a manual crank handle sharpener, because they still crumble really easily. I would just use the craft knife and get as fine a point as you need to, and then just use the sandpaper to sand the tip into a finer point. The 7th tip is to basically just use all of these tips together. Now that you have all of the knowledge of what to do leading up to the part where you actually put the whiskers down, it should be pretty simple to add in those whiskers. Start with the right paper so that you can add many layers of pastel. Use your harder pastels first and then your softer pastels towards the end so you don't fill up the tooth of your paper too quickly. Blend each layer of pastel as you go. Make sure that your pastel pencil is sharp when you are adding your whiskers, and if all else fails, try a softer pastel like the Caran d'Ache pastel pencil. I've got a playlist on the screen with some pastel tutorials that I thought you would find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.